Good morning. So are you ready to start sewing on your AccuFill quilting project? Well, I am, and I've done some preparation for this video, and what I'm hoping to accomplish in this little next several minutes, however long it takes, is we're going to talk about using the AccuFill hoop. We're going to talk a little bit about marking our fabric and making sure that our fabric has been set up appropriately to embroider on, and a little bit about just making sure that you test out your colors of thread so that you're going to get what you are expecting to get. So I think that actually where I'm going to start is with the template. So the last video that I had made for you was about finalizing your layout of your template in the layout mode of the Horizon Link Suite, correct? And when you've done that and you've printed your template, you're going to end up with this gigantic, depending on what it is you're making. I know that not all of the students are making the exact same sewing machine cover that I'm making and that I think some of you are. I believe there's also at least one person that's going to be making a table runner, so her proportions might be a little bit different. Obviously, because of the different designs that we're all using, our templates are going to look different. So this is mine, and you know, it's quite significant in size. When I actually printed it out and I got it all taped together, I was like, oh my gosh, that thing is so huge. Well, it is big because it's 3 pieces of paper wide by 3 high. Remember that? So what I'm just doing right now is I'm draping my template up over my sewing machine, and you can see there that, you know, that's about what it's looking like. I've got my machine actually set up with my extension table on here because I am getting ready to quilt, and I want to make sure that I have that extra stability under my ASQ hoop. This project's a little bit heavy. You know, it's a significant piece of fabric. It's going to be measuring for most of us about 32. Okay, so our original measurement was going to be a 24-inch wide by 32.5-inch tall project. In addition to that, you're going to have extra fabric that's sticking out around the outside edges of your design size so that you will have available fabric for when you are using the clamps on the ASQ 22 hoop, those big thick magnetic clamps. And so the piece of fabric that you're actually looking at cutting and preparing for embroidery is going to be a quilt sandwich that has at least 5 inches of fabric all the way around the outside edge of your template, the finished template size, and that's to give you the amount of fabric that you need to use those magnetic clamps that came with the hoop. All right, so basically if our design was 24 inches, we're adding another 10 inches onto that, so that's 34 inches wide. And if our finished measurement was about 32.5 inches, we're going to add 10 inches onto that, which brings us up to about the full width of a piece of fabric, which is 42 inches. That's going to be more than enough fabric for you to accomplish your project. It's going to work out just absolutely perfect with the width of your fabric. All right, so you know, I'm trying to drape this up over my machine, and it's giving me a good feel for, you know, most of the time when I'm going to be covering up my sewing machine, I'm not going to have the extension table on my outside on my table. So, you know, once that's actually out of the way, oops, I'm dropping some things here. Once that's actually out of the way, you know, your sewing machine cover is going to fit nicely on top of your machine if your machine is up and out of the table. If it's extended down inside, drop down inside of your table, obviously it's going to be a little bit oversized for that. Let me pick up my thread. Okay, so that covers a little bit about how big you're going to be cutting your fabric. I did press my fabrics very nicely, and I used some spray to secure the 3 layers together so that I don't get any shifting on here. So let's talk just a little bit about marking the fabric. I'm going to actually not demonstrate this, but just gab to you a little bit about it. So if your template is looking something similar to mine, you know, where my blocks are all pretty much of a similar size. I've got 3 rows wide by 4 rows high on my machine cover. And when I laid out my design, I laid it all out so that all of my center crosshairs of each design are all aligned perfectly. So in other words, let's just try to finalize this here. So let me just get this out of the way. So in other words, I don't have to worry so much about cutting holes in my paper template to use those actual crosshairs as my guides, what I'm going to mark on my fabric. What I can do is I can take measurements. So, you know, I can lay this down on top of my fabric, and I can get my quilting ruler out, and I can measure from the edge to the center point of this one, and that's where I can mark my fabric. Let's just say I did not get a ruler out, but let me grab one that's somewhat nearby. So let's just say that I've got my quilting ruler, and I'm going to measure from the center point of this first block. Let's see, I'm going to work on this block that's down here. All right, so here's my first block that I'm going to start my measurements from. This is just an example, okay? So if my block center from there to the edge of my fabric, I'm pretending that my template right now is the edge of my fabric, and if I measure that measurement and it's 4 inches, I will make my first row of crosshairs 4 inches, okay, from that edge of the fabric. So this one's 4 inches, this one's 4 inches, this one's 4 inches, etc., okay? Then your next set of crosshairs is going to be of equal distance between the first one and the second row. So take that measurement, and yours may be 5 inches, it may be, you know, whatever your template is reading at. Then you can mark your next set of rows. So what I'm basically trying to explain to, again, is that you don't actually, our typical is that when we've got paper templates is that we're cutting little holes, poking little holes with our hole cutter at the center point origin, and then at the other 4 directions. So this time, you know, you can just do it all by measuring rather than cutting your templates apart and poking holes in them. I hope that that makes sense to you. Just make sure that the whole template is centered on your fabric. All right. So that's just a little bit about, you know, maybe one of the differences in ways that we typically deal with our templates from what we need to do to right now with this one. If you feel more comfortable going ahead and cutting your crosshairs, you know, and poking those holes and marking the directional arrow, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm just saying that it's not absolutely necessary in this case. What is going to be very necessary is that remember that when we were doing this in the layout, and I was cautioning all of us to make sure that we did the sewing order in the order that we want our designs to stitch out in, which is basically from the center point outwards as much as possible. Each one of our templates that we then, or designs that we then sent to our sewing machine, is going to have a number associated with it according to that sewing order that we designated. So this design is going to be design number 7. This one down here is design number 6, etc., etc. So that's one thing that you might want to mark on your fabric. If you can see your fabric, if it's a light colored fabric like mine is, I can just, you know, simply write in there, you know, with my wash away marker, number 6, number 7, etc., just so that I can keep track of what direction, what design is going to go in what spot. The other thing that I like to do is on my fabric, I always like to mark a directional arrow for the top of my fabric. So, you know, if my piece of fabric is, you know, this big rectangle like this, I will put an arrow at the top, and I will mark that with a T to designate that that's the top. That also keeps me straight. So just those are some little tips that you might want to consider as you are using your template that you've printed out. So one of the things that I discovered happened with my project as I was working on it, let me show you what my fabrics are right here. This is going to be my backing fabric, and it will also be used for the binding. We'll talk about that a little bit more together. And then my actual quilted fabric is going to be this super nice quality muslin that I love, and it's kind of in an off-white color. So, you know, in the background you can see my sewing room. You can see that I've got some curtain panels on my closet where I store my fabric back over here. And I've got this kind of a cherry red, you know, reddish creamy color pinky thing going on in my room. So I wanted my sewing machine covers to match my room. And I pulled out of my stash. I knew that I wanted to use a variegated thread, probably. I was pretty certain that that's what I was going to choose to do all of the quilted motifs in my project, with probably a solid color as the border that goes around some of those blocks. So I pulled out my 2 variegated threads that I thought were going to be options. This one here is super shiny. I can see that it's kind of getting a little bit glary on the screen, so it might not be a good representation of what it actually looks like. Both of these fabrics or threads looked good with my background fabric that I was using. So what I decided, and they, of course, they looked really great with my muslin fabric. So I decided that I was going to do some stitches, practice stitching this to see which one I was actually going to prefer. I chose to do it this way rather than actually stitching out on, one of the quilted motifs because I just thought it would take a little bit less time. So I set my sewing machine up for some free motion quilting. And I threaded up my bobbin with the bobbin thread that I was going to be using, which is actually, by the way, is going to be the same thread in the bobbin that I'm going to use in the top. So for my experiment, actually, I just used some regular sewing thread in the bobbin that was not going to be an obnoxious color match. And I experimented with some free motion stitches with these two threads to kind of get a feel for which is the one that I actually am going to be using. I bet you can tell which one I choose. It's going to be this cotton variegated thread. This is actually a 30 weight cotton thread, and I was already kind of leaning towards the fact that I thought I wanted to stitch this with cotton rather than with an embroidery thread. Just my own personal preference for my project. Doesn't have to be that way for everybody. And I just did some squiggles and straight lines, and that helped me to make my decision about what thread to use. Okay, so I would highly recommend that you do that as well. If you're not good with free motion stitching, just maybe you're straight stitch in your machine. Maybe you might want to try a couple of decorative stitches or whatever. It doesn't have to be extensive, but please do some color testing just to make sure that you like your thread colors. All right, so that's a pretty important thing to do. Do the same thing with all of the threads that you might be considering for your project. Obviously, you're using the same fabric that you're going to be doing your stitching on. All righty. Next, I want to just reiterate that what we're going to be for our sewing machine setup, you are going to need a size 14 needle because that's going to give us, we're penetrating multiple layers. So I'm going to give you a choice on your needle. If you've got red tip Janome needles, which are size 14, that should be fine for your project. If you've got the Janome purple tips, that would probably be ideal. I just would like to caution you that going any smaller than a size 14, we might encounter some skip stitches or other stitching problems because this needle might just be a little bit too small for penetrating our layers. So what did I use for my batting? I actually used one of the Pellon polyester fleece products, and I've got my fabric over here. Let's see if I can get this to come up here without knocking a bunch of stuff over. Might not be able to. I wanted to talk a little bit about hoops in a little while, so let me just move my, let's get those out of the way. So my Pellon fabric or batting in the middle is the one that's pretty flexible. It's not thick and stiff. I don't even know what the number of it is, but it's kind of a lightweight batting. I don't want this to be super thick and super, it's not really keeping my sewing machine warm. It's just there for the texture and so forth. So, I laid out my pieces of fabric. As I said, I did press them so that they weren't too wrinkly. I did stick them together with some 505 spray. And I've now got my quilt sandwich, and it's going to be ready to market pretty quickly here. Let's talk about the hooping. All right, so this is where I'm actually going to pause the video, and I'm going to do a little, try to get my camera reacquainted so that I can do some quick little demonstrations on how you're going to get your fabric into your hoop.